Over the past several weeks, Brian has led us through our summer sermon series, Choose Your Own Sermon. These are topics that you chose, you voted on. These are the topics that you wanted to hear the most about. It's been a robust group of topics, starting with how to raise civil children in an uncivil world, all the way to last week, where Brian preached about the relevance of the church, whether it's still relevant at all, and if it is, how to prolong that relevance. And he gave a powerful message about how to push the line, that line between being comfortable and uncomfortable, the line that exists when we talk about tough issues like politics, policies, faith, theology. Brian preached about the reality that the church remains prevalent when we talk about the things that no one else will, when we're willing to push the line. If you haven't had an opportunity to listen to those sermons, I would encourage you to go to our church website or our church app. You chose these topics because they matter, because they're relevant for your lives today. This morning, we continue the conversation. This morning, we're going to talk about Jesus as a nonviolent rebel. I have to be honest, when I realized this was a topic I was going to be preaching on, I felt like really we were talking about two different things. Jesus as nonviolent and Jesus as a rebel. So what I'd like to do this morning is spend some time talking about each of these, and then we'll wrap up our time this morning sort of talking about how they work together. As it pertains to Jesus being nonviolent, Scripture is pretty clear. Everything that Jesus did participated in a nonviolent ministry. There are countless stories where Jesus disrupted violent tendencies of societal norms in order to maintain that level of nonviolence. He disrupted stonings, murders, leaving people to starve in the desert. He was constantly going against the societal norms of the day. Norms that said you were either clean or unclean. You were either in or out. Jesus didn't operate that way. Whether he was disrupting potential physical violence or the emotional violence of exclusion, Jesus disrupted that at every turn. As I was researching for this sermon, I came across the work of several scholars who say that Jesus' nonviolent ministry was embodied through 4 specific points of his ministry. Those points are how he chose his disciples, the way that Jesus' ministry transformed the environment, how he ate with sinners, and how he worked with women and foreigners. Now, there's no way that every single part of Jesus' ministry can fit in these 4 topics. That's not what the scholars are saying. What they're saying is that most of the things that Jesus did that related to nonviolence can be seen in these 4 parts of his ministry. So this morning, we're going to go through each of these and see how they're connected and how they're related to the ministry of Jesus, and we'll sort of see the ways in which they embody that nonviolence. The first one is talking about how Jesus chose his disciples. What we know from Scripture is that Jesus went up the mountain and summoned those followers he wanted, who came and joined him. He named 12 as his companions whom he would send to preach and to have authority to expel demons. I think there are 3 parts of this Scripture that are important to focus on as we understand the ways in which Jesus chose his disciples. First and foremost, he summoned them. He called on them. He didn't send out a draft notice. He didn't demand one person from every household come to him and become a disciple. He didn't force anyone to do anything. He merely called on them. He sent them a message and said, "Hey, will you join me? Will you come and see what I have to say?" And those that showed up are the ones that Jesus engaged. He brought willing disciples with him. And in order to be a disciple of Jesus, he made it very clear that you had to embody his ministry fully, which meant that they had to agree to embody nonviolent ways, which went directly against societal norms. And not only did they have to agree to live into that themselves, but they had to agree and go and preach it. They had to go against the structures that people considered normal, and they had to go talk against Pharisees and against the government, and to tell as many people as they could. And not only to tell people, but to encourage them to also go against those societal norms. And that, on its own, is a tall task. And for many of the disciples, it was a dangerous task. They were putting their lives on the line to preach Jesus' message. And that would have been enough. It would have been a big enough task. And Jesus could have just stopped there, but he didn't. He continued on and said, not only do you have to live into my lifestyle and do you have to go and preach it, but you also are now being given the authority to cast out demons. Now we know from Scripture that a lot of times demons came about in the form of ailments, physical ailments, people who couldn't walk or stand up straight or couldn't see, or who were sick and couldn't be healed by the medicine of the time. Or it came in the form of emotional ailments, hearing voices or having visions. And what happened when these people had these demons within them is they were outcast from society, considered to be completely abnormal and unworthy of normal societal respect. They were outcast. And we know from Scripture that there are times in which these demons were cast out through miracles. There are times in which Jesus merely touched someone and poof, demon gone. We know that Jesus performed miracles. And in many ways, his disciples did as well. But those miracles, if we look at the whole robust nature of Jesus' ministry, are a rather small part of it. It's really a small percentage in which those miracles happened, where people were raised from the dead. The majority of the ways in which Jesus and his disciples healed people or cast out their demons was through healing them. And there's no doubt that performing a miracle, bringing someone back from the dead, healing someone who has not been able to stand upright for over 20 years on the spot, there is no doubt that those miracles transformed environments. For the people who experienced it, for the people who witnessed it, I have no doubt that their lives were changed. But again, it's such a small percentage of the type of healing that Jesus and his disciples did. The majority of that healing came through the healing of presence. I'm not talking about standing awkwardly next to someone in an elevator, or even about sitting next to someone in a pew. I am talking about the healing of presence that happens when you sit with someone in a way that allows them to shed their barriers, to be absolutely and fully vulnerable, to share their stories, their fears, their failures, their sins. That kind of presence. And we know from Scripture that this kind of presence is transformative. Like when Jesus sat with a woman at the well, who fully believed that society did not care about her and that she was not worthy of that care. Jesus sat with her. He heard her story, and then he looked at her and he said, "You are enough. You are worthy." And he gave her living water, like the gift of presence for a woman who was about to be stoned to death. Jesus heard her story and told her she was worthy of love and acceptance, and he sent her on her way. we know that the healing of presence is transformative. It changes lives. And not just for the people who finally feel heard, but for the people looking around who see another way, who are taught another way of doing things, or for the people who were terrified that their stories would never be honored. When they see someone else's story honored, they're given the gift of hope. It transforms lives. One of the ways that Jesus often offered the gift of presence was by feeding people, eating with them. My guess is that if Jesus were alive today and he took the 5 love languages quiz, that Jesus' love language would be feeding people. So often in Scripture, that is how he showed his love. He ate with everyone. There are times in Scripture where Jesus shows up at someone's home, someone who's expecting to have a one-on-one dinner with Jesus, and he just brings people off the street. He says, hey, feed these people. There are times in Scripture where Jesus is already at someone's home, already at their table, and he looks around and he sees the servants and the slaves, and he says, feed them. Feed these people. And this was at a time when food was scarce. People often didn't know if they would have enough to survive. They made intentional decisions about who got to eat, what they got to eat, when they got to eat, and where they got to eat. And there were societal norms to this. And it was considered to be unclean to break those norms. And being unclean was the last thing you wanted to be. But Jesus didn't care. He brought people in left and right and fed them because they were hungry. And sure, a lot of times what he was feeding them was food. But there were also a lot of times where he is feeding them hope and love and inclusion. And he did not discriminate. It didn't matter who it was. The marginalized, the rich, the selfish, the thieves. He fed them. A lot of the times, the people that Jesus would feed that was most contrary to societal norms was when he worked with women and foreigners. 2 community groups who had no say in the policies that impacted their lives. 2 groups of communities who were often cast out quickly and efficiently just for being who they were. 2 groups of communities who were on the very bottom of the totem pole often. And Jesus came in, and not only did he feed them, but he brought them in and he taught them. He taught them how to live out his ministry. He equipped them to be leaders, and then he commissioned them to go and be those leaders. This was in many ways completely unheard of in that time. But Jesus did it anyway. He disrupted the violence of exclusion, and he equipped them to go and do the same. These are the ways in which Jesus' ministry completely embodies nonviolence, because they disrupted societal norms. In many ways, Jesus was completely countercultural to everything that was going on. If you weren't supposed to feed someone, he fed them. If you're supposed to outcast them, he brought them in. If you're supposed to stay quiet, he spoke. And when we talk about working with sinners, people that society had deemed unworthy, there is not a single time in Scripture where Jesus dismissed a wrongdoing. He always held people accountable. He just didn't stone them to death because of it. He realized that you can hold people accountable and still love them fully without participating in violent structures. And we know that Jesus teaches us that the greatest commandment after loving God with all of our hearts is to love one another. And I don't know about you, but I have no idea how to fully love someone while also being violent towards them. I do not know how to authentically love someone while participating in systems of violence that impact them negatively. I don't know how to do it. And I don't think Jesus knew either. So he refused to engage in violent tendencies. And as for the second part of our statement, Jesus as a rebel, the truth is that Jesus' nonviolent commitment is what made him rebellious. Jesus' absolute refusal to engage in violent tendencies, to perpetuate violent policies, is what made him rebellious. To use Jerry's word, he was relentless about it. And there were so many times that the Pharisees tried to trip him up. They would have conversations with him and try to catch him in a slip-up, to catch him sort of talking over himself or talking in circles. And they wanted to do this so that they could arrest him. They could imprison him and kill him because he was disrupting the societal norm, and the only way they could think to respond was through violence. But Jesus never gave in. He never gave in. He chose nonviolence at every turn, no matter what. And this is the part where I start to struggle, if I'm being honest. Because we know this about Jesus. Scripture is very clear. But that was then. And we live in the now. And Jesus isn't here anymore. He died on the cross. And yeah, he rose. He rose from the dead, and then he ascended. Jesus has no body on this earth. So I'm left wondering, who's going to continue the work? And then I am reminded of a poem by St. Teresa of Avila. And in this poem, she says, Jesus has no hands and feet on this earth, but ours. She's adamant in her belief that we are now the hands and feet of Jesus on this earth. That by being Christians, by committing to a life of Christianity, that we now take up the task of living out Jesus' ministry in this world. We take up the task of being non-violent rebels, of going against cultural norms or structures that perpetuate violence. That is what we're called to do. And maybe you're like me, and maybe that call sometimes feels just a little overwhelming. I cannot perform miracles. I cannot turn water into wine. I can't heal someone with a single touch. If someone were to reach out this very moment and touch my leg, all that would happen is awkwardness. That's it. They wouldn't be healed. Not like the woman in Scripture who's bleeding to death, who touches Jesus' robe, and in an instant, she feels her body begin to heal. I can't do that. I'm just a human. And I know that Jesus was part human, but he sure was part divine. And I don't know how to live into that. I want to perpetuate Jesus' nonviolent ministry, but I don't know if I can. And when I start to think this way, I start to wonder if maybe this is why Jesus told parables. Maybe Jesus told parables so that we could have stories of everyday people doing everyday, extraordinary things. Maybe we have parables so that we can know what it would look like to offer someone unshakable, unquestionable, unconditional love. Over the summer, the children downstairs in children's ministry have spent several weeks talking about this parable. About 6 weeks to be exact, they spent on the parable of the Good Samaritan. I can't think of another parable that fully gives us a picture of what it looks like to be a non-violent rebel who's human. And the way the story starts is that a man is engaged in conversation with Jesus. He's asking Jesus about what it means to be a proper follower. And so he asks Jesus this question. He says, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "There was a traveler going down from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. The traveler was beaten, stripped naked, and left half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The priest saw the traveler lying beside the road, but passed by on the other side. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way, and this one too saw the afflicted traveler and passed by on the other side. But the Samaritan, who was taking the same road, also came upon the traveler and, filled with compassion, approached the traveler and dressed the wounds, pouring oil and wine. And then the Samaritan put the wounded person on a donkey, went straight to an inn, and there took care of the injured one. The next day, the Samaritan took out 2 silver pieces and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, 'Look after this person, and if there's any further expense, I'll repay you on the way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbor to the traveler who fell in with the robbers?" Jesus asked. The answer came, "The one who showed compassion." Jesus replied, "Then go and do the same." So here we have this traveler who has been robbed and beaten and stripped naked and left to die on the side of the road. A priest is the first person that comes upon this traveler. Someone who's made a lifelong commitment to serve the church, to serve the temple, to live out God's teachings. This is the first person to come across the traveler. And perhaps weighed down by the societal norms, the ones that say, if someone is bleeding and you touch them, you then become unclean. The norms that say that people who are naked in public are unclean. The norms that say if you associate with that person, you become unclean. Perhaps weighed down by that, the priest goes to the other side of the road and keeps on walking. And then a Levite comes by. So too, perhaps weighed down by the norms of society, walks by. And then a Samaritan comes along. Someone who is a foreigner, an outsider, someone who knows that the societal norm tells him to just keep his head down, keep on moving, don't make waves. Don't draw attention to yourself. Scripture tells us that this person is filled with compassion. It's as if they couldn't help themselves and they stop. Completely led by their compassion, with their own bare hands, they dress and treat this person's wounds. And then they take this person, they put him on their own donkey. And they take this injured person to an inn where, with their own money, this Samaritan, with their own money, pays for that injured person to have safe sanctuary. Takes care of them. And Jesus tells us at the end of this parable that our task is to go and do the same. I don't know about you, but when I really stop and think about it, there are times I can remember so clearly when I walked right past someone who was hurting. I just kept moving. There are times I can remember thinking, next time, I'll stop next time. Or I'm just too busy right now, I just have so much going on. There are times that maybe in the midst of my own pain and struggle, I just thought, no, I'm hurting too. I don't have time for this. And I'm not just talking about the strangers on the street. But surely I'm not the only one who's walked past the stranger on the street. But my guess is that I'm also not the only one who has walked past someone I know in the midst of their struggle and just thought, I can't deal with this. Not today. And it's not because we're malicious, right? It's because there's something happening in society that tells us this is okay. That everybody does it. But Jesus tells us this story to point out that if you do it, fine. But you are not living into Jesus' call. Jesus says that we are supposed to be guided by a sense of compassion, that we're supposed to be filled with compassion to the point that it allows us to buck the systems, the societal structures that currently exist that, to be honest, are deeply rooted in violence. There are some norms that exist that talk about how exclusion is okay. Jesus says absolutely not. Under no circumstances is it okay. You should be filled with compassion. Go and help those people. And it's not an easy call. It's a hard call. But it is ours, nonetheless. We are called to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world, which means we must take up the task to be nonviolent rebels. We must seek to dismantle and disrupt violent systems at each and every turn until our dying breath. Because that is what Jesus did. I leave you this morning with a challenge. Will we seek to be nonviolent rebels at every turn, from now until our dying breath? Will we seek to dismantle violent systems and structures with every fiber of our beings in the way that Jesus did? And will we teach others that love is the greatest commandment that we have, to love one another in the way that we love God? Will we become the nonviolent rebels we are called to be? I pray that we do. Amen.